She's smarter than half the force, and I mean that with all due respect to my fellow officers, Deputy Rick Collins muttered, hands on his hips, staring at the thick woods on the edge of Baxter County. The morning sun hadn't yet burned off the mist that hovered above the grass, and the air smelled like pine and dew. He wasn't even talking to anyone in particular, more to himself, and maybe the squirrel perched on a branch nearby. But his frustration was genuine. It had been nearly 4 months since the first call came in. Reports of a large dog, maybe a shepherd mix, roaming the outskirts of town, always alone, always just out of reach. At first, no one thought much of it. Stray dogs were part of the landscape, like broken fences and rusty mailboxes. But then came the second call, then the 5th, then the 10th. People swore the dog wasn't just roaming. It was watching. "She's out there again," came the familiar voice of Irene from dispatch, crackling through Rick's radio. "Same spot as yesterday, north end of Carter's Woods." Rick sighed and looked toward his cruiser. "On my way." The drive was short. The woods weren't even 10 minutes from the station, nestled between a forgotten stretch of old highway and a disused train line. Rick had been here more times than he could count. Sometimes the dog was there. Sometimes she wasn't. When she was, she never ran far, just out of sight. Like she was guiding them, or maybe warning them. Locals had started calling her Lucy. No one knew why. Maybe it was just easier to give the mystery a name. Lucy was big, with a thick, dark coat that made her blend into shadows. Her eyes were sharp and gold. Not mean, just observant. She didn't bark. She didn't growl. But she never let anyone get close. Rick parked the cruiser and stepped out slowly, scanning the trees. He didn't expect to see her right away, but this time, she was there. She stood a dozen yards off, near the same old cedar she'd been spotted at all week. As soon as he met her gaze, she turned and slipped deeper into the woods. "All right, Lucy," Rick muttered. "Let's see where you're taking me." He left the cruiser and started on foot, boots crunching on twigs and leaves. He'd tried following her before, but she always gave him the slip. Today, something felt different. She wasn't bolting, she was glancing back, checking if he was still behind her. About 10 minutes in, the woods thickened. Rick slowed, brushing aside low branches. Lucy waited ahead, then moved again. The trees broke, and suddenly he was in a clearing he hadn't seen before. It was small, overgrown, the kind of place only animals remembered. And in the middle of it, there was a shed. It looked ancient, wood slats weathered to gray, the roof half collapsed. There were vines snaking up one side and rust on the hinges. Rick froze. He hadn't known there was a structure back here. Lucy sat beside the shed, tail still, ears up. Rick approached slowly, hand resting near his holster. Not out of fear of Lucy, but in case someone else was nearby. The shed door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open with a creak. At first he thought it was empty, then his eyes adjusted. There were blankets. A bucket, a few torn grocery bags, empty tins of dog food, and in the corner, bundled in a pile of rags, was a little boy. Rick's breath caught. The child was asleep, curled up on his side, hair matted, face smudged with dirt. Maybe 6 years old. Maybe younger. Thin, but breathing steady. Rick knelt carefully, not wanting to startle him. "Hey, buddy," he said softly. "You okay?" The boy stirred, blinking slowly. His eyes opened, blue and wide. "Lucy?" he asked. Rick looked over his shoulder. The dog was still there. watching. "Yeah," Rick said gently. "She brought me here." The boy didn't say much at first. Rick called in for backup, ambulance, child services, the works. He wrapped the boy in his jacket and stayed close until help arrived. Lucy stayed too, just on the edge of the clearing. As the paramedics checked the boy and officers swarmed the area, she didn't run. She didn't bark. She just watched. It wasn't until the boy was safely in the ambulance that she turned and slipped away. Over the next few days, the town buzzed with the news. The boy, his name was Jacob, had been missing for months. His parents were gone. The house was empty. No one had reported it. Some neighbor thought they'd moved. No foul play, just neglect and silence. But somehow, Jacob had survived. With Lucy. "She took care of him," Rick told the sheriff, who'd come down from the county seat to handle the press. "There's no other explanation. That dog fed him, kept him warm, stayed with him. She led us right to him." The sheriff rubbed his chin. "You saying we make her an honorary deputy?" Rick smiled. "Wouldn't be the worst idea." They searched the woods again, but Lucy was gone. For a while. A week later, Irene called in another sighting. Same area. Rick drove out again. She was there, near the shed, sitting, waiting. This time she let him come closer. He crouched, holding out his hand. "Hey, girl. You did good. You did real good." She sniffed his fingers. Didn't flinch. Over the next few weeks, Rick came back again and again. Sometimes with food. Sometimes with nothing but his company. Lucy stayed skittish, but she didn't vanish. She let him sit nearby. Once, she even took a treat from his hand. One morning, he found her curled up beside the shed, tail wagging slowly when he approached. "Thinking about making this your home?" he asked. She just blinked at him. Rick started thinking too, about the house he lived in, the backyard, the quiet evenings. He hadn't had a dog since he was a boy, but the silence in his place had never felt louder than since Lucy had walked into his life. He didn't rush it. Days turned to weeks. Then one day, Lucy followed him to his cruiser. He opened the passenger door. She looked at it, looked at him, and then jumped in. The whole department clapped when he brought her in. They even gave her a badge. Just a toy one, of course. But Rick wore it on his uniform for a week. Jacob, now placed with a foster family in town, came by the station one afternoon. When Lucy saw him, her tail thumped like a drum. She licked his face, circled him, then lay down at his feet. "She kept me warm," Jacob said, petting her gently. "She brought me food. She didn't talk, but she stayed. Every night." No one had much to say after that. The papers called it a miracle, the kind of story that makes you believe in something bigger. But Rick didn't need the papers. He had Lucy. And every time she looked at him with those golden eyes, he knew something simple and true. This dog had saved a life. And maybe, just maybe, she'd saved his too. The first time Lucy saw snow from the porch of Rick's house, she didn't quite know what to make of it. She stepped carefully off the wooden planks and into the white powder with a suspicious air, lifting her paws higher than usual and sniffing the ground like it had betrayed her. Rick stood in the doorway, coffee mug in hand, watching her with a grin that tugged at the corner of his weathered face. "Bet you haven't seen too much snow from under that shed roof," he said aloud, even though he knew she didn't need the commentary. He'd taken to talking to her like an old friend, like she was just another person in the room who happened to walk on 4 legs and be smarter than most folks he knew. Lucy made a few hesitant steps, then paused. Rick could see her ears twitch at a distant sound. Wind maybe a branch shifting. Then she glanced back, eyes locked on him like she wanted to make sure he was still there. He raised the mug in a kind of salute. "I'm not going anywhere, girl." Over the past 2 months, their routine had settled into something steady. She slept inside now, usually by the back door, curled tight on the thick old rug Rick had dragged in just for her. She still didn't like loud noises, didn't like the television much, and absolutely hated the vacuum cleaner. But she'd taken to the quiet, steady rhythms of Rick's life, like she'd been born for it. Rick was quieter these days, too. Not out of sadness, but something more like reflection. Lucy didn't demand attention. She didn't bark at every shadow. But she was always there, listening in a way no human could. He found himself telling her things he hadn't said out loud in years. Memories of his dad's farm, stories about the job, even the little things like which coffee tasted better from the gas station. One Friday afternoon, Rick brought home a cardboard box from the station. He set it on the kitchen table and pulled out a photo album, thick and dusty. "Never thought I'd open this again," he muttered. Lucy padded over and sat beside the chair, resting her chin on his knee. Inside the album were photos of a much younger Rick, his academy graduation, fishing trips with his brother, and a dog with ears too big for its head. "That's Murphy," Rick said softly, tapping the photo. "My first partner. You would have liked him. Big goofball. Thought he could herd cars." He turned the page. Another picture showed Murphy lying across a picnic blanket, surrounded by kids. "4th of July, '89. Best ribs I ever made. Murphy stole 3 off the plate, and everyone blamed my uncle." Lucy's tail gave a soft thump. Rick glanced down. "You're part of this now, you know. My story." The doorbell rang. Lucy was up in a flash, body tense, ears forward. Rick stood, pressing a hand to her back. "It's all right. Probably just Ben." It was. Officer Ben Marsh, fresh-faced and always a bit too eager, stood on the porch holding a folder. "Hey, Deputy. Got the lab results on those tins we found near the shed." Rick opened the screen door. "Come in, before you freeze your ears off." Ben stepped inside, eyes scanning the room. "Nice place. Cozy." Lucy gave him a once-over, then circled back to her rug. She didn't growl, but she didn't wag either. Ben handed over the folder. "Turns out someone was dropping off food. Regularly. Those tins were all from the same brand, same store in town. Like clockwork. We pulled security footage." Rick raised an eyebrow. "And? Guy named Harold Nelson. Lives off Mill Road. Retired mechanic. Kind of a hermit." Rick flipped through the papers. "Any idea why he didn't say anything?" Ben shrugged. "Said he didn't want to get involved. Saw the boy once. Thought he was part of some foster family camping out. Never saw the dog until later. Then he figured the dog was a stray and left food when he went hiking." Rick closed the folder. "I think I need to pay Mr. Nelson a visit." "Want backup?" "Nah," Rick said. "I'll take Lucy." Harold's house was a squat, paint-peeling structure surrounded by rusting trucks and a yard full of pine needles. Rick pulled up the gravel drive, Lucy in the passenger seat, nose pressed to the window. Harold answered the knock after the second try. He was wiry, with a long face and eyes that seemed half hidden under a cap pulled low. "Yeah?" "Mr. Nelson, I'm Deputy Collins. I'm not here to accuse you of anything. Just need to ask a few questions about the woods near Carter's." Harold leaned against the doorframe. "You got the dog with you?" Rick nodded. "She's the reason that boy's alive." Harold glanced past Rick, looking at the cruiser. Lucy stared back. "I seen her," Harold said. "She used to watch me from the trees. Never got close. But when the kid disappeared, I kept going back. She was always there. Kinda figured she was guarding something." You never thought to call anyone? Harold shook his head. Didn't know who to trust. Cops don't come out this way unless it's trouble. Rick didn't argue. He just waited. I left food, Harold added after a moment. Didn't want them starving. The boy, he looked scared, real quiet. But I figured if I got too close, he'd run. Could have helped, Rick said, voice low. I know, Harold said. But she was helping more than I ever could. Rick nodded slowly. Thanks for your time. Back in the cruiser, he sat in silence for a long moment. Lucy rested her head on his leg. Sometimes people don't know what to do, he murmured. But you did. That evening, snow started falling harder. Rick pulled out a second blanket for Lucy's corner and added another log to the fireplace. He made a pot of stew and set aside a small bowl of broth and meat for her. She ate it carefully, then padded over and rested beside the couch where he sat, reading an old paperback. He looked down at her. You're not going anywhere, are you? She blinked. A week later, Rick was called to speak at the local school. Third graders wanted to hear about Lucy. The principal said they'd been writing letters, some with drawings, all asking about the dog hero. Rick agreed, reluctantly. Public speaking wasn't his thing, but he figured maybe it would do some good. He brought Lucy, of course. The kids were wild with excitement. One little boy, red-headed and full of energy, asked if Lucy could do tricks. She doesn't do tricks, Rick said with a smile. She does miracles. The classroom went quiet. He told the story, how she found Jacob, how she led him through the woods, how she waited even when no one came. He left out the rougher details, kept it simple. Lucy sat by his side the whole time, calm and regal. When he finished, a girl raised her hand. Does she miss the boy? Rick paused. I think she knows he's safe. That's what mattered to her. Another kid asked, Is she your dog now? Rick looked at Lucy. She looked back. I think we belong to each other. The kids clapped. Lucy wagged her tail once, a quiet approval. Later that night, Rick got a call from Jacob's foster father. He's been asking to see the dog again, the man said. Keeps saying she's his family. Rick made arrangements. They met at the park. Jacob ran straight to Lucy, who bounded toward him with a joy Rick hadn't seen in her before. She didn't leap or bark, just pressed her head against his chest and stayed there. The boy sat on the grass, arms around her neck. She came every night, he whispered. I didn't feel scared when she was there. Rick nodded. She's good at that. Jacob looked up. Can she visit again? As many times as you want. As winter gave way to spring, Lucy settled more deeply into her new life. She patrolled the yard like it was her post, barked at squirrels like they were invaders, and rode with Rick on his daily rounds. People in town started waving at the cruiser more, kids pointing when they saw the dog in the passenger seat. Rick started keeping treats in the glove box. Lucy learned which ones rattled the most. One afternoon, Rick pulled over to help an old man with a flat tire. As he stepped out, Lucy hopped down too. The man blinked at her. Well, I'll be. That the dog from the story? Rick smiled. That's her. She real? The man asked. Did all that? Rick glanced at Lucy, who was now sniffing around the man's toolbox. She's as real as it gets. That night, Rick found himself looking out the back window, watching Lucy chase something across the yard. A rabbit, maybe. Or a dream. He picked up the phone and called his brother, someone he hadn't talked to in months. Maybe it was Lucy's influence. Maybe it was just time. They talked for an hour, about old memories, about their parents, about Murphy. "You sound better," his brother said. "Different." Rick smiled. "Got a dog again?" "Yeah? What's her name?" "Lucy." "Good name. Sounds smart." "She is." And as Rick hung up, he felt something shift. A weight lifting, a warmth settling in. He walked to the back door and opened it. Lucy came bounding in, her coat damp with evening dew. She shook once, then curled up by the fire. Rick watched her for a moment, then turned off the lights. Another day had ended, but their story was just beginning. Lucy wasn't a fan of thunderstorms. Rick noticed it one evening when the sky turned a bruised gray and the wind pressed heavy against the windows. The first rumble of thunder came like a drum roll from the heavens, and Lucy was off the couch before the sound had finished. She didn't bark or whine. Instead, she disappeared into the bathroom and curled up behind the toilet, shivering like it was the end of the world. Rick found her there a few minutes later, kneeling down with a towel and a flashlight, even though the power hadn't gone out yet. "You don't have to hide," he said gently, kneeling down on the cold tile. "Not here. Not anymore." He sat there with her, back against the tub, legs stretched out. The storm rolled in hard, rain slamming sideways against the house. And still, he stayed. Lucy crept out eventually, cautious, keeping her body close to the ground like the sky might fall on her. She laid down beside him with a heavy sigh, her tail thumping once in appreciation. By the time the power flickered and went out for real, Rick was already asleep on the bathroom floor, with Lucy pressed against his side. That was the beginning of something deeper. Rick had loved dogs before. Murphy had been more than a pet, more than a partner, but there was something about Lucy that wasn't just about love. She understood fear, silence, and the way people sometimes carried both like invisible coats. She didn't beg for affection. She waited until it was needed. In the following weeks, her place in town grew more official. People started calling the station to leave treats or toys, some even mailing in letters addressed to Deputy Lucy. The station chief, a big man with more belly than belt, grumbled about professionalism, but eventually had a plaque made for her corner near Rick's desk. "Lucy, community companion." She earned it. She had a way with people. Even the rough ones, the ones brought in angry or scared, looked different when Lucy sat nearby. Something about her presence disarmed tension. Once, a teenage boy picked up for shoplifting sat on the floor and talked to her for nearly 20 minutes before saying a word to Rick. "She listens," he said when asked. Rick nodded. "Yeah, she does." One morning, Irene from dispatch called Rick over to her desk. "There's a guy on the phone says he knows Lucy from before." Rick blinked. "Before what?" "Before she found Jacob. Says he used to see her near the rail yard. Feeding her sometimes. Wants to come talk." Rick hesitated. Part of him felt protective, like someone was trying to claim something sacred, but he agreed. The man showed up that afternoon. He was tall and lanky, with a ponytail tucked under a ball cap, and hands that never seemed to stop fidgeting. He introduced himself as Dennis Hayes. "She was stray," he said, looking at Lucy from across the room. "Used to hang around the old train yard. Me and some of the other guys working freight would toss her scraps. She wouldn't let nobody get close." Lucy stared at him for a moment, then wandered back to Rick's desk. Dennis watched her go. "Didn't think she'd remember me." Rick nodded. "She's got her own way of remembering. What else do you know?" Dennis scratched his chin. "Not much. She always stayed near the tracks. Then one day, she was gone. Heard later a kid went missing, and a dog found him. Knew it had to be her." Rick didn't know what to say to that. Lucy wasn't property. She wasn't a story someone else could close. Dennis seemed to sense that. "She picked you," he said after a beat. "That's all there is to it." Rick nodded. "Thanks for coming." Later that week, Jacob came to visit again. His foster parents stood back, letting him have space. He didn't run to Lucy this time. He walked slowly, calm, like someone visiting a friend they respected too much to rush. She met him halfway. They sat on the floor together while Rick made coffee and chatted with the family. Jacob told Lucy about school, about a spelling bee he was nervous for, and about the hamster his foster brother had that bit everyone. "He doesn't bite me, though," Jacob said proudly. Rick glanced over. Lucy had her chin on Jacob's knee. "She's helping me sleep," Jacob said suddenly, looking up at Rick. "Like I dream better now." Rick swallowed a lump in his throat. "She does that." The next few weeks were quiet. Spring rolled in fully, and with it came longer days, more patrols, and the beginning of Rick's favorite season: baseball. The town's Little League team had its first practice, and Rick was invited to bring Lucy to opening day. She wore a bandana someone from the community center had sewn just for her, red with little white bones stitched across it. The kids loved her. One boy, about Jacob's age, tried to teach her to catch a baseball. She ignored the ball entirely and chased a butterfly instead. "Can she be our mascot?" the coach asked, laughing. "She's got a busy schedule," Rick said, "but I'm sure she'll stop by." Then came the call. It was just past 9 on a Tuesday night. A fire had broken out in a trailer on the edge of town. Rick was one of the first responders. Lucy, as usual, was in the cruiser. By the time he got there, the fire department was already working, water arcing into the air in streams lit orange by the flames. Neighbors stood on lawns in their pajamas, faces pale. A woman came running up to him. "My dog!" she cried. "He's inside! I couldn't get him out!" Rick didn't hesitate. He moved toward the door, firefighters shouting warnings. The smoke was thick, but he knew how to navigate. Years on the force had taught him that much. He found the dog, small, white, trapped under a collapsed side table. He scooped it up and ran back out just as the porch began to groan under the weight of the fire. The woman sobbed in relief as she took her dog into her arms. The crowd clapped. Rick stood back, coughing, eyes burning. From the cruiser, Lucy barked. Just once, sharp and clear. Rick smiled. "Don't worry, girl. Still got it." Back at home, after a long shower and 2 mugs of water, he lay down on the couch. Lucy jumped up beside him without hesitation. "You know," he said, scratching behind her ears, "we make a pretty good team." Her tail tapped twice against the cushion. The next day, Irene gave him a small envelope with his name written in careful cursive. "What's this?" It came in the mail, no return address. Inside was a note. Simple. No signature. "She saved more than one life. Thank you for seeing it." There was also a photo. A blurry shot of Lucy in the woods, standing over Jacob, protective and alert. Rick tucked it into his wallet. That evening, Rick and Lucy drove out to Carter's Woods. The shed was still there, barely holding together, weathered by time and the seasons. He stood there a long while, Lucy beside him. "We're not done yet," he said softly. She looked up at him, ears perked. "There's more to do." He wasn't talking about crime or patrols or even the town. He was talking about people. About the ones who needed to know someone would sit with them in the storm. about kids who needed to feel safe, about neighbors who didn't trust anyone, but maybe would trust a dog. Lucy understood. Together, they headed back to the cruiser. Tomorrow, they'd start again. When Rick walked into the hardware store with Lucy trotting beside him, it took exactly 3 seconds for old Larry Bennett to wave from behind the counter and say, "The celebrity herself graces us again." Lucy wagged her tail once and walked straight to the aisle where the rawhide chews were kept. Rick chuckled and tipped his cap. "She's got a good memory." Larry leaned on the counter. "More like she's got better manners than half the customers I get. Didn't think I'd say that about a dog." Rick grabbed a couple of items, a length of chain-link fencing, a bag of cement, and 2 boxes of screws. He tossed in a few treats for Lucy on the way out. "Fixing up the shed?" Larry asked as he rang things up. Rick nodded. "Thought I'd reinforce the place. It still stands, but it won't last another winter. Figured we'd clean it out, too." Larry raised an eyebrow. "She gonna help?" "She'll supervise." Outside, Rick loaded the truck while Lucy leapt into the passenger seat like she owned it. The drive to Carter's Woods was quiet, the kind of quiet Rick had come to appreciate. He didn't need to fill every moment with talk, not when Lucy was around. She made silence feel like company. When they reached the clearing, Rick walked up to the old shed and circled it slowly. The roof sagged more than before. Moss had started to creep up the side. He'd brought gloves, a crowbar, and enough supplies to rebuild half of it if needed. Lucy sniffed the corners carefully, then laid down in the grass, watching. As Rick pulled out the broken slats and tossed them into a pile, he thought about Jacob, about how that boy had survived in this place. It wasn't just Lucy that kept him alive. It was something else. Some will. Some thread of hope. But Lucy had been the anchor. He worked for hours, stopping only when Lucy barked once, low and sharp. He looked up, wiping sweat from his brow. Someone was standing at the edge of the clearing. A man, maybe late 20s, with a heavy backpack and a skittish look. He stepped forward slowly, hands visible. "Didn't mean to scare you," he said. "Just heard there was a dog out here. Thought maybe she was still around." Rick stood straight. "You lost?" "No, I'm from the shelter, the one over in Linton. We heard about her. Lucy. She's sort of famous. I just wanted to see." Lucy hadn't moved. She stayed where she was, alert but not aggressive. Rick nodded toward Aaron. "That's her." The man dropped his pack. "She's amazing. We get dogs sometimes that, well, they don't have that spark. But when I read what she did, I thought, maybe there's hope, you know?" Rick nodded slowly. "There's always hope. You just have to know where to look." The man knelt down, not too close, and Lucy rose, walking toward him slowly. She sniffed his hand, then sat. He smiled. "She's more than I imagined." Rick walked over. "You work with animals every day?" "Yeah. Mostly strays. Some come in real bad. Takes weeks just to get them to look us in the eye." Rick looked at Lucy. "She's been through worse than most." The man nodded. "I can see it." They talked a while longer. The man's name was Kevin. He didn't ask to take pictures or get Lucy to perform anything. He just sat and listened while Rick talked about rebuilding the shed. "You thinking of making this a permanent place?" Kevin asked. "Not for me," Rick said. "For her. For kids like Jacob. Maybe a quiet spot for them to come and remember that being scared doesn't mean you're alone." Kevin stared at him for a moment. "That's a beautiful idea. If you need help, the shelter would pitch in. We've got volunteers who'd love to do something like this." Rick nodded. "I'll keep that in mind." Kevin left a while later, promising to return with a few tools and some extra hands. Rick kept working until dusk, Lucy never more than 10 feet away. The next day, help arrived. Kevin brought 2 teenagers from the shelter. Both had been through tough breaks. One had scars down his arms from something he wouldn't talk about. The other barely spoke above a whisper. But Lucy went to them, like they were old friends. By the end of the day, the teens were hammering and laughing, covered in sawdust. The scarred boy tied a red bandana around Lucy's neck. She kept it on. "She reminds me of the dog I had," he said quietly to Rick, "before I went into the system." Rick handed him a bottle of water. "She's good at remembering people like you." That weekend, they held a small gathering. Nothing big, just a few folks from town, the kids from the shelter, and Jacob's foster family. Rick didn't advertise it. He didn't want it to be a spectacle. It was just about honoring something real. They planted a tree near the shed. A simple marker sat at its base. For those who waited in the dark, and those who came to find them. Jacob stood next to Lucy, one hand on her back, the other holding a sunflower he'd brought from his new backyard. He planted it carefully beside the tree. After everyone left, Rick sat on the rebuilt steps of the shed. Lucy lay beside him, her tail swishing now and then. "You've started something," he said. "You know that, right?" She licked his hand. Days passed, then weeks. Spring bloomed into summer, and the shed became something of a haven. People started calling it the quiet post. No signs, no fanfare. Just a place where you could breathe. Rick didn't go every day. Sometimes the volunteers were there. Sometimes kids came alone. Lucy always knew when to visit. She'd stand at the door, waiting, and Rick would grab the keys. One evening, he found a letter taped to the shed. No name, just careful handwriting. "I came here today because I didn't know what else to do. I was going to run. Then I saw the dog. She didn't say anything, obviously, but she looked at me like she'd been there too. So I stayed. And I think I'm going to go home instead. Thank you." Rick folded the note and tucked it into his pocket. When he turned, Lucy was watching him, head tilted. "You're changing lives, girl." He knelt, scratched behind her ears. "And I'm just trying to keep up." That night, as they drove home, Rick looked over at her, content in the passenger seat. "Tomorrow," he said, "we start building the bench. That way, folks don't have to sit in the dirt." Lucy thumped her tail against the seat. He didn't see it as a project anymore. It was a promise. To Jacob. To kids like the ones from the shelter. To the scared and the lost. And to Lucy. She had been alone once, standing guard in the cold. Now she was showing others how to find the way back. But Rick knew. They were only getting started. Rick always said that summer in Baxter County had 2 speeds. Slow and even slower. The kind of season where the heat clung to your clothes before breakfast and mosquitoes formed their own neighborhood councils by sundown. But that summer was different. That summer, things moved with a quiet purpose, like Lucy had wound the whole town into a better rhythm. It began with the bench. Rick built it by hand, just like he'd promised. Nothing fancy. 2 thick planks of reclaimed oak from a barn that collapsed near Mason Ridge, sanded until smooth and oiled with care. He carved a small message into the backrest with a pocket knife he'd had since high school. "You're not alone. Sit a while." Lucy watched the whole process with the concentration of a supervisor inspecting union labor. She only left her post when a squirrel dared to cross into the clearing. Rick swore she had a sense of timing, because every time he hammered in a nail, she'd thump her tail against the ground once, as if approving the progress. Word got around about the bench. The shelter kids had already been coming on weekends to clean up the area and tend the flower beds that were now springing up around the shed. But after the bench, something shifted. People who had never set foot in the woods started finding their way there. Teachers on their summer breaks. Retired veterans. Even a group of teenagers who brought their guitars and sang softly while Lucy sat nearby, head tilted as though critiquing the harmony. Rick didn't mind the visitors. He just made sure to come early in the mornings with Lucy before anyone else arrived. That hour was for them. She'd stretch her legs, sniff around, and lie down beside the bench while Rick sipped from his thermos and read whatever paperback he'd pulled off his shelf that week. One morning, he found a painted rock sitting on the bench. It was small, smooth, with a blue paw print, and the words, "Thank you, Lucy," in neat handwriting. Rick turned it over and smiled. The next week, 3 more appeared, each with a short message. You helped me breathe. You waited for me. I wasn't ready, but you were. Rick built a shelf inside the shed just to hold them. Then came the girl. She arrived on a Thursday, late afternoon. Rick was cleaning out a tangle of weeds near the east side of the shed, Lucy lounging in the shade behind him. He saw her from the corner of his eye. A thin girl, maybe 14 or 15, with a backpack that looked heavier than she was. She didn't make a sound. Just stood there at the edge of the clearing. Frozen. Rick didn't say anything at first. He gave her space. Let her see that she wasn't being watched, not really. Lucy noticed her too. She didn't get up. Just raised her head, ears perked. Eventually, the girl stepped forward. Slowly, carefully. She walked to the bench and sat, her back stiff, hands folded tightly in her lap. Lucy stood then, stretched, and walked over. She didn't touch the girl, just sat in front of her, quiet and still. That's when the girl started crying. Rick stayed where he was, giving them the moment. It wasn't until the girl wiped her face with her sleeve and whispered something, too soft to hear, that Rick stood up and walked over. You thirsty? He asked gently. She nodded. He handed her a bottle from the cooler he kept in the back of the truck. I'm Rick. That's Lucy. You don't have to tell me anything if you don't want to. The girl took a sip. Her hands shook. Is this the place? She asked after a while. Rick tilted his head. What place? The one from the article. The safe place. Rick looked at Lucy, who was now resting her head on the girl's foot. Yeah, he said. This is the place. She came back 3 times that week. Rick never pried. He didn't ask about the bruises he glimpsed when her sleeves slid back, or the way she flinched at loud noises. He just let her sit. Sometimes she talked to Lucy in whispers. Other times she just sat in silence, watching the leaves sway. Eventually, she told him her name. Emily. Then one day she showed up with her mother. The woman looked tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep could fix. Rick saw the weight of worry in her face before she even said a word. She told me about this place, she said quietly. About the dog. I didn't believe it until she begged me to come. Lucy approached the woman, sniffed her hand, then nudged it gently. The woman's eyes welled up. She said Lucy saved her. Rick looked away, his throat tight. I didn't know what was going on, the woman continued. She kept things hidden. She's been hurting and I didn't see it. But she says this place helped. Said Lucy helped her feel seen. Rick simply nodded. From that day forward, the shed became more than a symbol. It became a center, a place people could go when they didn't have the words for what they were feeling. And always, Lucy was there. Rick kept a notebook now, hidden inside the shed. People wrote in it when they needed to. Some entries were pages long. Others were just a single word. One said, "Finally." Lucy's presence continued to draw folks from further and further away. A counselor from the next county over started bringing kids from his youth program once a month. A church group came and built a small stone path leading from the edge of the woods to the shed, weaving through the trees like a quiet trail. Rick didn't ask for any of it. He just welcomed everyone. Late one evening, after a long day of patrol and paperwork, Rick pulled into the driveway and stepped out of the cruiser. Lucy jumped down, sniffed the air, and bolted toward the backyard. Rick followed slowly, expecting to see a raccoon or maybe the neighbor's cat. Instead, he found a cardboard box sitting by the shed. Inside, curled up together, were two puppies. Tiny things, no more than a few weeks old. Eyes barely open. Lucy sniffed them once, then looked at Rick. He bent down, lifting the corner of the box. A note was taped to it. "Couldn't keep them. Didn't know who else would care. She seems like she would." Rick looked at the pups, then at Lucy, who was now lying beside the box like a sentry. "Guess we've got new recruits," he said. The next morning, he called Kevin from the shelter. They worked out a plan. The puppies would stay with Rick for now, and Lucy would take charge. And she did. She watched over them, licked their ears, and let them crawl all over her without complaint. Rick couldn't help but smile at the sight. The tough, mysterious guardian of Baxter County, now playing nanny to two squirmy balls of fur. Kids who visited the shed started asking about the pups. Rick let them hold the babies, careful and gentle. One boy asked if they had names. "Not yet," Rick said. "Can I name one?" Rick nodded. The boy thought hard, then pointed. "That one's Lucky." "And the other?" Rick asked. The boy looked at Lucy, then at the puppy snuggled against her side. "Hope." Rick swallowed and nodded. "Lucky and Hope. Sounds about right." Things settled into a new rhythm. Lucy, Rick, Lucky, and Hope. The days were full, the evenings quiet. And though Rick never would have said it aloud, he felt something building. Something good, steady, and worth protecting. There were more visitors, more letters, more painted stones. And the notebook in the shed began to fill faster than ever. But Rick knew. This was only the beginning. Lucy had more work to do. And so did he. Rick never expected the mayor to show up at his door, especially not on a Sunday morning, wearing khakis and a fishing vest like he'd just wandered in from a catalog photo shoot. "Deputy Collins," Mayor Dalton said, tipping his sun hat with one hand and balancing a to-go coffee in the other. "Mind if I have a word?" Rick, still in his t-shirt and holding a wrench from fixing the back gate, stepped aside. "Sure, but if you're here to talk about paving more sidewalks near the courthouse, I'm off duty." Dalton chuckled. "Not quite." Lucy wandered into the room and sat beside Rick, looking at the mayor like she was already evaluating his motives. Dalton noticed her right away. "There she is," he said, nodding in admiration. "The famous lady of the hour." Rick raised an eyebrow. "This about Lucy?" "Well, yes. And no. Mostly yes." Dalton walked to the living room window, staring out at the backyard where Lucky and Hope were tumbling over each other in the grass. "The council's been talking," he said. "We've been watching the impact that Shed has had. The people showing up. The stories coming in. It's turned into something we never expected. Rick crossed his arms. That was never the goal. It's not a campaign. I know, Dalton said. That's why it works. He turned. We'd like to expand it. Rick blinked. Expand? Dalton nodded. Not change. Just build around it. Maybe a few more benches, a garden, possibly a small indoor space, climate-controlled so it's usable year-round. Nothing flashy, just more space for healing. Rick looked down at Lucy. She tilted her head, but said nothing. Who's paying for it? Rick asked. Dalton grinned. Donations. We've already got folks asking where they can send money. I wanted your blessing before we took another step. Rick walked to the porch and leaned against the railing. The morning was quiet, the kind of quiet that carried meaning. Birds chirped, leaves rustled, and Lucy came to sit beside his boot. I don't want it to turn into something commercial, Rick said finally. It won't, Dalton promised. We're not putting up signs, no ticket booths, just helping the place do what it's already doing, reaching people. Rick took a breath. All right, but I get to review the plans. Deal, Dalton said with a wide grin. The planning started that week. Kevin from the shelter offered his crew to help clear brush and prepare the site. Irene from dispatch drew up a volunteer schedule so the area could stay clean and cared for. Even the high school shop class got involved, building new benches and a small wooden sign that simply read, Lucy's Post. Rick was hesitant about the name at first, but when he told Lucy about it, she licked his hand and went back to chewing on a piece of rope tied around a stick. That was approval enough. Through it all, Lucy remained the center of it, never acting like a mascot, never demanding attention, just watching, comforting, and making sure everything was in its right place. Hope and Lucky grew fast. They started following Lucy's lead, mimicking her movements. Hope was the more adventurous one, always darting ahead, barking at shadows and butterflies. Lucky was quieter, often found sitting beside Lucy, tail wagging gently, as if trying to understand the world through her eyes. One afternoon, Rick took all 3 dogs out to the shed, now surrounded by a new gravel path and dotted with flower beds built from old tractor tires painted by local kids. As he sat on the bench, sipping his coffee, a young man approached. He was tall, thin, and wore an Army Reserve sweatshirt. He looked nervous. Mind if I sit? Rick nodded. Of course. The man sat down carefully. Lucy walked over and placed her head on his knee. He froze, then gently touched her fur. I've seen her online, he said. Didn't believe it at first. Thought it was one of those stories people make up. She's real, Rick said. The man nodded. I've got some stuff I haven't really talked about. Things from my last deployment. But I read about this place and I kept thinking about that dog. Thought maybe she'd understand. Rick didn't respond right away. He just watched as Lucy leaned into the soldier, her body relaxed, calm. She does, Rick said. Better than most people ever will. They sat there for over an hour. The man spoke softly, not all at once, but slowly unraveling a story he'd carried too long. When he left, he scratched Lucky behind the ears and gave Hope a quick belly rub. Rick watched him go, then looked at Lucy. You knew he needed that, didn't you? She blinked once. That night, Rick pulled out his old journal. He hadn't written in it for years, not since his last partner passed. But now, with the light of the porch filtering through the window and Lucy lying across his boots, he felt the need. He wrote about the day. about the soldier, about the way Lucy still surprised him, even now. Then he added a note to himself. Build a covered area by the bench, something for when the rain comes. Rain did come a few days later, a soft, steady drizzle that turned the gravel path dark and fragrant. Rick stood under a tarp strung between two trees, watching as a group of teenagers sat on the porch of the shed, huddled together while Lucy rested in the middle of them. One of the teens was sketching. She held up her notebook when she saw Rick watching. The drawing was of Lucy with her two pups, sitting beneath the tree that Jacob had planted a year ago. You got talent, Rick said. She smiled. She's easy to draw. Rick glanced at the notebook again. Under the drawing, the girl had written, Guardians don't always wear armor. Summer deepened. The air grew thicker. Fireflies came out in the evenings, blinking lazily over the grass. Rick installed solar lights along the trail leading to Lucy's post. He made them low and warm, soft enough not to disturb the quiet. Emily started volunteering every Saturday. She helped water the plants, clean the benches, and once even taught a visiting group of younger kids how to paint stones for the growing collection along the garden path. She was stronger now, still quiet, but no longer afraid of her voice. Her mother came sometimes too, baking muffins for the volunteers, sitting under the oak tree with a paperback in hand. One Saturday, Rick found Emily sitting alone on the bench. Lucy was next to her, chin on the girl's knee. Hope lay nearby, chewing a stick. Everything all right? Rick asked. Emily nodded. I just wanted to sit with her. She looked up. Is it weird that I don't want to tell her anything? I just want to be near her. Rick shook his head. Not weird at all. Some things don't need words. A breeze stirred the trees, and a few petals from the flower beds drifted across the clearing. As fall crept in, so did the colors. The trees around the shed exploded into reds and golds, and Rick found himself taking more photos than he ever had before. Irene from Dispatch joked that he should start a calendar. Kevin thought they should build a website. Rick didn't love the idea, but he didn't say no. He understood now that the story didn't belong to him. It belonged to Lucy. And she wasn't finished yet. That October, a school counselor from 2 towns over brought a class of students to visit. Rick gave them a quiet tour, explaining the history in broad strokes. Lucy walked with them, Hope and Lucky close behind. One boy stopped at the bench and looked down at the carving Rick had made over the summer. Someone had added small wooden letters beneath it. Lucy's watch. The boy turned to Rick. Do you think she knows? Rick crouched beside him. Knows what? That she's the reason people come here? Rick looked at Lucy. She was sitting near the tree, watching a leaf spiral to the ground. I think she knows enough, Rick said. And I think she's okay just being here. The boy nodded, then sat down. Lucy walked over and laid at his feet. Rick turned to look at the horizon. The sun was setting behind the trees, casting long shadows across the grass. There was more to do, more visitors to greet, more kids to listen to, more quiet hours to share beside a dog who had once stood alone in the cold and now stood at the heart of something much bigger. And Rick would be there for all of it. By the time the first frost settled over Baxter County, Rick had already traded out the summer screens for storm windows and added 2 more blankets to Lucy's corner bed. Hope and Lucky now filled out their frames, no longer wobbling pups, but full-sized young dogs with their own quirks and habits. Hope had taken to chasing the mail truck halfway down the block before circling back like it was all a great game. Lucky, more reserved, spent most mornings watching the horizon like he was waiting for someone. The quiet post had changed too. What started as a clearing in the woods with a broken-down shed was now a soft, purposeful space filled with handmade touches from people who needed it. Wind chimes crafted from tin spoons danced in the breeze, and a mosaic of colorful stones spiraled out from the central tree like a sunburst. Rick didn't direct any of it. He just watched it grow around Lucy, the way vines wrap around something strong. One chilly morning in early November, Rick pulled into the gravel lot beside the trail entrance and noticed something unusual. A sedan with out-of-state plates sat parked and running, exhaust curling into the cold air. Lucy, who had been half dozing in the passenger seat, lifted her head and let out a low, curious woof. Rick stepped out and approached slowly. The driver's side window rolled down. "Morning," Rick said. "Looking for something in particular?" A woman with silver hair and worry lines on her face looked up at him. "I heard about this place," she said. My son was here a few months ago. He never talks about anything anymore. But he told me about the dog, said she made it okay to sit still." Rick softened. "You're welcome to walk in. It's always open." The woman looked down at her hands. "I brought something. For her. Is that all right?" "Of course." She reached into the passenger seat and held up a small knitted blanket, the kind that looked homemade, all uneven stitches and bright, clashing colors. "He made it," she said, "after his last visit." Rick felt a tightness in his chest. She'll take good care of it. They walked the trail together. Lucy padded ahead, nose low to the ground, leading without a word. When they reached the clearing, the woman stood still for a moment, taking it in. The benches, the flower beds, the carved signs, the painted stones, and in the center, beneath the old tree, Lucy sat like a statue. "She remembers," Rick said quietly. The woman folded the blanket and laid it on the bench. "Thank you for keeping this place." "It's her place," Rick replied. "I just mow the grass." After she left, Lucy sniffed the blanket once and circled it before curling up on top, tail curled around her nose. Hope and Lucky flanked her, resting their heads on their paws. That afternoon, Rick added a new entry to the notebook in the shed. Just a few words. Some gifts warm more than the skin. The next few days brought a string of early snow showers, enough to dust the trees, but not enough to stick for long. Still, the cold slowed things down. Fewer visitors came out, but those who did stayed longer. They huddled closer. They told stories more often. One man, a former pastor who'd recently lost his wife, brought a thermos of cocoa and passed out cups to anyone who came by. He didn't talk much about his grief, just said that sitting with Lucy made him feel less alone. Rick started carrying a folding chair with him on patrol. He'd stop by the post during lunch breaks, sip coffee beside the fire pit they'd built from old bricks, and jot down notes in his weathered journal. He began to notice something he hadn't expected. People were forming friendships here. Not just passing interactions, but real connections. Teenagers who had once visited in silence now returned in pairs or small groups, carrying bags of snacks or art supplies. One boy set up a chessboard on the bench and played matches against himself, while Lucy sat beside him like a furry referee. Rick didn't interfere. He just let it happen. Then one evening, just before closing up the station, Irene called out to him. "You might want to check this." She handed him an envelope addressed to Deputy Collins and Lucy. No return address. Inside was a letter written in careful script. "Dear Deputy and Lucy, you don't know me, but my son came to see you last spring. He was in a dark place then, angry, closed off, hurting in ways I couldn't reach. He never told me what happened that day at the shed. But he came back different, softer, calmer, like something inside had been given a place to breathe. Last week, he helped another boy at his school who was going through something similar. He said, 'If we don't show up for each other, who will?' He said Lucy taught him that. I don't have the right words for what this place has done. But please know it matters. It matters more than you'll ever know." Rick folded the letter and slid it into the growing binder of stories he kept locked in his file drawer. Then he sat down at his desk, hand resting on Lucy's head. "You're changing people," he whispered, "and they don't even know how to explain it." That weekend, the town hosted its annual harvest market downtown. Booths lined the sidewalks, selling everything from spiced cider to handmade candles. Someone had set up a small display about Lucy's post. Just a poster board, some photos, and a donation jar with a carved wooden lid. Rick wasn't there. He didn't need to be. But Lucy's photo sat at the center of the display, flanked by pictures of painted stones and handwritten letters. The donation jar was full by noon. Meanwhile, out at the shed, Rick was stringing up lights. Simple white bulbs powered by a solar panel Kevin had helped install. As twilight fell, the lights flickered on, casting a soft glow across the clearing. Lucy lay beneath the tree, watching. "Cozy enough for you?" Rick asked. She blinked slowly. Hope and Lucky wrestled in the distance, kicking up dry leaves. Rick took out a small tin box from his coat pocket. Inside were clippings, articles, photos, thank you cards. He thumbed through them, then added a new one, a sketch someone had left earlier that day of Lucy sitting beneath the tree, her silhouette framed by starlight. It wasn't a shrine. It wasn't a memorial. It was a living archive, and Rick treated it with reverence. Later that week, something new happened. A young man named Corey, who had volunteered over the summer to help build benches, returned with a guitar slung over his back. He sat down near the fire pit and started to play. Soft, slow songs. Nothing flashy. Just melodies that fit the space. Lucy padded over and sat near him. Hope lay on her back, legs in the air. Lucky curled up beside the bench. Others arrived, quietly, respectfully. They didn't clap or cheer. They just sat and listened. Some sang softly. Some closed their eyes. One girl started humming along and crying at the same time. Corey came back the next night, and the next. By the third evening, someone brought marshmallows. By the fourth, a boy showed up with a harmonica. They didn't need a schedule. It just happened. Rick stood at the edge of the clearing, hands in his coat pockets, watching the scene unfold. Lucy walked over and nudged his leg. "You approve?" She looked up at him, tail swishing once. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." The cold deepened. More blankets were brought to the bench. The post stayed open through the first snowstorm of December, the paths cleared by hand, the fire pit kept stocked with dry wood donated by the local mill. Rick built a covered box for the letters people left, lined with cedar and felt. He labeled it Whispers. He didn't read them. Not unless someone asked him to. But just knowing they were there, tucked away and safe, made something settle in his chest. And through it all, Lucy remained. Not because she had to, because she chose to. And Rick, every day, chose to follow her lead. The snow arrived heavier in January than it had in years. Baxter County went from postcard perfect to buried in an igloo overnight, and for the first time since Lucy had taken up her post in the clearing, Rick had to shovel his way down the path. The trees bent under the weight of white, and the little fire pit sat like a forgotten crater, ringed by snowbanks waist-deep. Rick came prepared. He brought a shovel, rock salt, and a thermos full of strong black coffee. Lucy walked beside him, head high despite the wind, her coat already gathering flurries like she was trying to blend into the landscape. Hope and Lucky followed, their paws disappearing in the snowdrifts, bounding and barking with the joy only young dogs could sustain in cold like this. The bench was buried, and the signpost looked like the last survivor of a winter storm. Rick took his time clearing the bench, brushing the snow off with careful sweeps. When he was done, he poured out warm water into a metal dish for the dogs and sat down, steam rising from his coat. "You'd think it'd be too cold for visitors," he muttered, "but something tells me someone will show up." Lucy lay beside him, eyes closed against the wind. He was right. By mid-morning, a father and daughter trudged down the path. The girl looked to be about 8. Wrapped in so many layers, she waddled more than walked. She held a pink notebook close to her chest, and when she saw Lucy, her face lit up in that way Rick never got tired of. "She's here," the girl said, pointing. "Told you, Daddy." Rick stood and offered a nod. "Cold day to be out." The man laughed. "She wouldn't stop talking about coming. Said Lucy would be waiting, snow or no snow." The girl approached slowly, then sat down beside Lucy and opened her notebook. "I wrote her a story," she said, "about a dog who keeps the moon from falling." Rick blinked. "That sounds like a good one?" The girl read it out loud. 5 pages of imagination and wonder. Lucy stayed perfectly still, her golden eyes locked on the girl's face the entire time. When she finished, Rick clapped once. "Think you've got a real gift." The girl stood, closed her notebook, and laid a small charm on the bench, shaped like a crescent moon. For her? Because she holds things up. Rick waited until they were gone, then picked up the charm. He turned it over in his palm. Lucy nudged his arm gently, and he smiled. The next day, Rick brought a mason jar to the shed. He added the charm to it, labeled the jar Tokens, and placed it on a new shelf beside the Whispers box. People started adding things immediately: a friendship bracelet, a folded drawing, a button from a denim jacket. That week, Rick got a call from a teacher in the neighboring county. Her students had read about Lucy's post in the paper, and now they were working on a class project called Letters to Lucy. She asked if they could send them in. "Of course," Rick said. "She reads better than I do." A few days later, a large envelope arrived. 30 letters, each one in a different voice, a different kind of truth. "Dear Lucy, I don't like loud noises. I know you probably don't either. Thank you for helping the boy who didn't talk. I don't talk much either. Lucy, my grandma says you're a soul dog. I think that means you see the parts of people they hide. That's what she said. I think I hide a lot, but I wouldn't mind if you saw it." Rick spent an entire afternoon sitting in the shed reading the letters out loud, while Lucy rested her head on his boot. Hope and Lucky lay nearby, occasionally rolling over and snoring. By the end of it, Rick had decided to install a weatherproof bulletin board inside the shed. He pinned up each letter carefully, like museum pieces, not for display, but for remembrance. Kevin stopped by one morning with 2 new volunteers. Both were college students studying social work. They'd heard about the post through a classmate and asked if they could interview Rick and spend time observing. "Observe what?" Rick asked. Kevin grinned. "The impact, the healing, the ripple effect." Rick raised an eyebrow. "This isn't a clinic. It's a dog with a good heart and a spot in the woods." "That's why it works," one of the students said. They stayed for 2 hours, took notes, and walked the trails. One of them sat on the bench for a long time, while Lucy rested beside him. When they left, he turned to Rick and said, "I came to study resilience. I think I found grace." Rick didn't have an answer for that. He just patted Lucy on the head and let the wind fill the silence. The sheriff stopped by later that week. "Got a call from a news outlet," he said. "They want to do a feature on the place. Big story, maybe even national." Rick frowned. "I don't think that's a good idea." "Why not?" "Because this place isn't about headlines. It's about sitting still, listening. People don't come here to be seen. They come to feel safe." The sheriff nodded. "I figured you'd say that. I turned them down." "Thanks." But word spread anyway, in quieter ways. One person at a time. A woman who'd found peace here told her brother. He came and brought his son. Then the son wrote a poem about Lucy that got published in the school paper. That poem made its way into a regional magazine. Rick didn't stop any of it. He just kept clearing the path and making sure the shed stayed warm. One day, he found a visitor sitting at the bench before dawn. The man was wrapped in a thick coat, face hidden in a scarf. "I'm sorry," he said as Rick approached. "I couldn't sleep. I didn't know where else to go." "You're fine," Rick said. "You're here. That's what matters." Lucy sat beside the man, pressing her body gently against his leg. The man began to cry. He didn't give his name. He didn't say what brought him. But before he left, he placed a key on the bench. "It doesn't open anything," he said. "Not anymore. But maybe someone else needs to know they can put things down." Rick added the key to the tokens jar. By mid-February, the weather began to shift. The sun stayed a little longer in the sky, and the snow began to thin. But the visitors never slowed. One afternoon, a young boy wandered up to Rick, while Lucy and the pups were curled in the shade. "Do you think she ever gets tired?" the boy asked. Rick knelt beside him. "She rests when she needs to, but she always shows up." "Like a lighthouse?" Rick smiled. Exactly like that. That night, Rick sat by the shed under a blanket, journal in his lap, Lucy's head on his knee. He watched the stars blink overhead and thought about the lighthouse metaphor. It fit. Not just for Lucy, but for what the space had become. Not a rescue, a light, a steady place in the storm. He added a new carving to the underside of the bench the next morning, small and tucked out of sight. It read, "You are seen. You are safe. You are home." And Lucy, as always, sat beside him while he worked. Spring came slow and gentle that year, like even the weather didn't want to disturb what had taken root in Baxter County. The trees began to bud, shy at first, then bursting into color, as if the forest had finally exhaled. Rick noticed it in little ways, the birds returning before dawn, the soft give of the ground beneath his boots, the way the air held just a little more promise. Lucy still led him down the path every morning. Hope and Lucky trailed behind, older now, but still full of energy, still watching their mother like she was the compass that kept their world in place. Rick couldn't argue with that. She was his compass too. The shed stood unchanged, though the trail around it had widened with use. New footprints every day. New letters in the whispers box. The jar of tokens was nearly full now, and Rick had added a second one just last week. Kevin helped him mount it to the back wall with a simple sign: Overflow of Love. The town had adjusted to the presence of Lucy's post like it had always been there. People didn't question it anymore. They just visited. Some came to cry. Some came to think. Some just came to sit beside a dog who didn't ask for explanations. Rick had stopped writing down the number of visitors. Somewhere around the 500 mark, he realized the number didn't matter. What mattered was that they came. And that Lucy was there. One Sunday morning in late March, Rick opened the shed and found a folded blanket on the bench. On top of it sat a small photograph, grainy, black and white, of a dog that looked an awful lot like Lucy, sitting beside a child on a farmhouse porch. On the back, someone had written, "Every generation has one. She's ours." Rick ran his fingers over the corner of the photo and placed it gently in the binder with the others. He sat for a long while afterward, Lucy beside him, the pups asleep in the grass. "You know they'll talk about you for a long time," he said quietly. "You'll be a story folks pass down." Lucy didn't move, but he felt her tail brush against his boot. The following week brought the town's annual spring fair, and for the first time, Rick allowed a small booth to be set up near the station. Nothing flashy, just a place where people could pick up handouts about the post, sign up for volunteer shifts, or take home little wooden tokens carved by the high school shop class. Each one bore a single paw print and the word "stay." Rick brought Lucy by for an hour. She didn't stay long, just enough to greet a few kids, accept a few pets, and let one boy place a daisy behind her ear before wandering back to the cruiser. She was slowing down. Rick noticed it in the way she walked, still strong, still proud, but with a stiffness in her joints that hadn't been there the year before. She no longer chased Hope when she darted into the woods. She let Lucky take the lead now, and when she laid down, she stayed there a little longer. He didn't say anything. Didn't mention it to the sheriff, or Kevin, or even Irene. But he knew. That night, he sat on the back porch with her, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders, and the pups curled up at his feet. "You've done more than anyone could have asked," he whispered. "More than I could have imagined. You've given them all a reason to believe again." Lucy looked up at him, golden eyes steady. There was no fear in them. No pain. Just knowing. In April, a letter arrived addressed only to the one who keeps the light on. Rick opened it carefully. Inside was a single sentence written in delicate handwriting. "She found me in the dark. I will carry her light for the rest of my days." There was no signature. He folded the letter and placed it in the binder, then added a third jar beside the others, labeled "Carried Light." May came with warm rain and longer days. The wildflowers returned, painting the edges of the clearing in yellow, blue, and soft violet. Rick walked the trail with Lucy and the pups every morning, never knowing who might be there waiting. Some days, it was no one. Some days a dozen. It didn't matter. One morning, Lucy didn't get up when Rick called her. She blinked, stretched slowly, then lay her head back down. He sat beside her, brushing her fur with one hand. "You tired?" he asked. She didn't move, just let out a long, slow breath. Hope came and laid beside her. Lucky curled up at her back. Rick didn't force anything. He just stayed. That evening he carried her down the path himself, wrapped her in a soft blanket, and cradled her close, the way he had once carried Jacob from the woods, the way Lucy had once carried them all. The clearing was quiet when he arrived. The sun was just beginning to set, and the air held that golden hush that only comes at the end of something true. Rick laid her on the bench beside the jar of tokens, beside the letters and the stones. He sat beside her, hand on her back, not speaking. Hope and Lucky laid down nearby. The wind moved gently through the trees. By morning, word had spread. Rick didn't know how. Maybe someone had seen. Maybe the world just knew. People came quietly. No speeches. No ceremony. Just presence. They brought flowers, letters, stones with new words carved in. Children read stories. Teenagers played songs. One man lit a single candle and placed it in the fire pit. Rick didn't leave her side all day. When the sun began to fall again, he stood and addressed the small group that had gathered. "She never asked for any of this," he said. "She just showed up, and stayed, and watched, and made it okay for the rest of us to do the same." He paused, eyes misting. She saved a boy. But what she really did, what she kept doing, was remind us that quiet matters. That sitting still with someone is sometimes the bravest thing you can do. He didn't say more. He couldn't. They buried her beneath the tree Jacob had planted. A simple marker. Her name. One paw print. Rick added one final message beneath it. She stayed. The shed remained. The path stayed open. People kept coming. Letters still filled the boxes. Stones still lined the trail. Hope and Lucky took turns greeting visitors, never straying far. And Rick still walked the trail every morning. But now, when he sat on the bench, he didn't sit alone. Lucy was there. In the wind, in the hush, in the steady silence that had become the most powerful sound of all. And the light she lit, quiet, constant, full of hope, kept burning. Because that's what she taught them. To stay,